Picture this. You wake up, look out your window, and your city is completely swallowed by a thick, yellowish fog. And we are not talking about a gentle, misty morning here. We're talking about a dense, suffocating wall of toxic air so incredibly dark you literally cannot see your own hands in front of your face. It sounds like something straight out of a dystopian movie, right? But for Londoners in December 1952, this was a terrifying reality. The Great Smog of London was this absolutely lethal cocktail of freezing weather, completely stagnant air, and relentless coal smoke. Over just a few days, it brought one of the biggest cities on Earth to a complete standstill. So in this explainer, we're going to dissect the anatomy of this tragedy, look at how it claimed thousands of lives, and see how it ultimately changed the way the entire world breathes.
Now, to really grasp the sheer horror of this event, we have to listen to the people who actually walked through it. Stan Cribb, a mortician's assistant, was trying to lead a funeral procession on the very first day of the smog. He later said, "You had this swirling like somebody had set a load of car tires on fire. It's like you were blind." Just think about the visceral dread of that moment. The air was so incredibly thick that his boss actually had to get out of the car and walk in front of it with a bright light. But the smog was so impenetrable that even a blinding light offered almost zero help.
You'd have massive double-decker buses just creeping out of places like Fleet Street, relying entirely on the eerie glow of emergency fog lighting just to inch forward. The whole city looked like a horror film. This total lack of visibility paralyzed London. It wasn't just some weather nuisance. It was a suffocating darkness that completely severed the basic, everyday functions of urban life.
Section 1. 5 Days of Darkness. Timeline of the smog. Let's trace how this paralyzing nightmare unfolded over what would become the darkest week in modern London history.
1 foot. By Saturday, December 6th, visibility had dropped so drastically that in some areas it was officially recorded as nil. People literally reported that they couldn't even see their own shoes. Think about that for a second. Londoners actually had to carry lanterns and wave white pieces of clothing while walking just to avoid crashing into each other on the sidewalks. The pure desperation of just trying to get home is perfectly captured by a resident named Jim Tilley. He got stranded after a soccer game and had to walk from Hammersmith all the way to Southall in pitch blackness. He recalled, "We were guided by the trolley bus wires, which we could see above us glistening from the streetlights. So slowly we trudged home." Imagine having to feel your way through miles of city streets, completely blinded, relying on nothing but the faint glint of overhead electrical wires to guide you to safety. Normal life was entirely upended. Headlights just glowed helplessly as traffic was reduced to an absolute crawl. Ambulances stopped running entirely. Trains were brought to a halt. At railroad crossings, workers actually had to place explosive percussion caps right on the tracks so that the train wheels would trigger loud bangs, warning pedestrians they couldn't see that a train was coming. And of course, crime surged, with burglars taking full advantage of the ultimate cover of darkness.
The horror just kept compounding day after day. It started on Friday, December 5th, when the smog initially settled. By Saturday, visibility plummeted to near zero. Through Sunday and Monday, the fog thickened relentlessly, pushing its way indoors. It wasn't until Tuesday, December 9th, that a fresh wind blew in from the west, finally pushing that toxic cloud out over the North Sea. But what exactly held that deadly cloud in place for so long?
Section 2. A lethal weather inversion, trapped in toxic air. The underlying cause of this disaster wasn't just smoke. It was a deadly combination of chemistry and meteorology. Let's break down the science behind this killer fog. The crucial mechanism we need to understand here is the temperature inversion. Normally, smoke from chimneys rises up into the atmosphere and naturally disperses. But in early December 1952, a massive high-pressure system, an anticyclone, just hung right over London. It pushed cold air downwards, trapping it underneath a layer of warmer air above. Basically, it put a giant, invisible lid over the entire city. That cold, polluted air simply had nowhere to go.
The cause and effect here were direct and undeniable. You had massive facilities like the Battersea Power Station continuously belching thick smoke into this trapped air, while everyday citizens, like typists working inside their offices, were forced to wear makeshift gauze masks just to breathe. Because of the inversion, all that smoke from massive power plants and millions of small household chimneys was trapped. The smog literally pushed its way inside homes, churches, and even hospitals. 15 million tons. That is the staggering amount of coal London was consuming every single year back then, just to heat households and power industrial processes. To make matters worse, the weather right before December 5th had been exceptionally cold, so Londoners were burning even more coal than usual to stay warm. And we're talking about low-quality post-war coal that had an incredibly high sulfur content.
The true horror really lay in the chemical makeup of that trapped cloud. Every single day during this period, the city was pumping out 1,000 tons of smoke particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, and 14 tons of fluorine compounds. And most dangerously, 370 tons of sulfur dioxide were being converted directly into 800 tons of highly toxic sulfuric acid. Londoners weren't just breathing in fog, they were literally inhaling acid.
Section 3. Counting the human cost. A silent slaughter. The toll this chemical soup took on living things was absolutely catastrophic. It became a mass casualty event that no one fully realized was happening until the morgues actually began to overflow.
Even a seemingly calm afternoon stroll required people to wear smog masks, completely hiding the reality of a silent slaughter going on around them. Because the smog crept in everywhere, there was no safe haven. The death toll was heavily concentrated among the elderly and folks with pre-existing respiratory or cardiovascular conditions, and it caught city officials completely off guard.
The consequences across the city were as bizarre as they were tragic. The fog spared no living thing. Disoriented ducks were found dead in the streets after flying blindly into the sides of buildings. At Sadler's Wells Theater, a performance of La Traviata had to be abandoned mid-show because the theater filled with so much smog the audience couldn't even see the stage. Over at the Smithfield show, young prize cattle were asphyxiated by the toxic air. And chillingly, city officials only truly realized the magnitude of the human crisis when they noticed that London's entire supply of coffins was almost completely exhausted.
12,000 lives lost. While initial government reports estimated around 4,000 deaths, modern researchers, who factored in the long-term respiratory effects in the weeks and months that followed, placed the true death toll at around 12,000, with an additional 100,000 people made severely ill. And the long shadow this event cast on public health is undeniable. A fascinating recent study by Joshua Graf Zivan, looking at children conceived or born around the time of the smog, reveals a massive spike in childhood asthma. By isolating the population exposed to the specific event, the data proved definitively that the horrific air didn't just claim lives in 1952, it damaged the lungs of an entire generation before they could even take their first breath. Section 4. The Clean Air Revolution, a turning point. Out of this profound tragedy came a desperately needed revolution. The sheer shock of the mortality rate finally forced the government's hand, ending centuries of inaction and birthing the modern era of air quality management. The immediate legacy of the disaster was the Clean Air Act of 1956. This was a landmark piece of legislation that completely revolutionized urban living. It mandated the transition away from household coal fires, which, as we learned, were the biggest single smoke producers. It created strict smoke control areas in cities where black smoke emissions were entirely prohibited, and it forced factories to finally convert to smokeless fuels. It fundamentally changed urban living, forever banishing those deadly coal fogs from London streets. Section 5. A lasting global legacy, worldwide awakening. The impact of this legislation didn't just stop at the borders of the United Kingdom. It sparked a massive worldwide awakening.
The tragedy sparked what was basically a global domino effect. The UK's Clean Air Act of 1956 was the very first of its kind, and wealthy nations immediately began to emulate it. By 1960, France published its first major environmental act. By 1963, the United States tackled pollution at a federal scale, passing its own Clean Air Act. The disaster in London proved to the world that environmental regulation wasn't just possible, it was an absolute necessity for our survival.
This leaves us with a profound thought to consider. Did the darkest 5 days in London's history ultimately save millions of lives globally? By forcing the world to finally look at the toxic air we were creating, the tragedy of the 1952 Great Smog became the true catalyst for the modern environmental movement. It's a stark reminder that while we have made incredible progress, the air we breathe is deeply precious, and protecting it is an ongoing responsibility. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.